In a world where loneliness can feel like a shadow that never lifts, one rainy day changed everything for Aisha. She was a woman drowning in silence, her heart heavy with emptiness, until a scruffy dog named Max looked into her eyes and saw her soul. Their story isn't just about a girl and her dog, it's about love so deep it defies time, fear so real it chills the bones, and a goodbye so silent it echoes forever. The silent goodbye, a dog's love beyond time, is a journey of hope, heartbreak, and the unbreakable bond between two souls who found each other when they needed it most. Get ready to laugh, cry, and feel your heart race as you witness a love that transcends life itself. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to feel less alone, and subscribe for more tales that remind us what it means to love and be loved. Let's honor Max's memory together, press that button, and let's keep his spirit alive. In the quiet gray corners of a suburban town, where the streets were lined with identical houses and the air carried a faint scent of loneliness, lived Aisha. She was a young woman in her late 20s, her life a monotonous cycle of waking up, going to work at a dull office job, and returning to an empty apartment that echoed with silence. Her days blurred together, each one heavier than the last, as if the weight of her solitude was a cloak she couldn't shed. Friends had drifted away, family was far, and love, well, love seemed like a distant dream she no longer had the energy to chase. One dreary afternoon, as rain tapped relentlessly against the windows of her office, Aisha decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. The rain was cold, soaking through her thin coat, but the rhythmic patter somehow felt less oppressive than the fluorescent lights and endless emails. As she cut through the park, her shoes squelching in the mud, something caught her eye, a small, trembling figure huddled under a weathered bench. It was a dog, scruffy and soaked, his fur matted, and his eyes wide with fear. He didn't bark or growl, he just stared at her, his dark brown eyes glistening with a mixture of hope and despair. Aisha froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't an animal person, she'd never had a pet, never felt the need for one. But something about this dog, the way he looked at her as if she were his last chance at salvation, pierced through the numbness she'd carried for years. "Hey, little guy," she murmured, kneeling down despite the mud soaking through her pants. The dog didn't move at first, his body tense, but then, slowly, his tail gave a tentative wag. It was the smallest gesture, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through Aisha's chest. She reached out, her hand trembling, and he sniffed her fingers before pressing his cold, wet nose against her palm. In that touch, something shifted, a spark of warmth in the cold, rainy afternoon. She couldn't leave him there. The thought was absurd, she lived alone, had no experience with pets, and certainly didn't have the time or resources. But those eyes, they held her captive, as if they were windows to a soul that had already decided she was its home. So she scooped him up, his frail body shivering against her chest, and carried him to her apartment. That night, as the rain continued to fall outside, Aisha sat on her worn-out couch, a threadbare blanket wrapped around the dog she'd named Max. She wasn't sure why she chose that name, it just felt right, like it had always belonged to him. He lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, his breathing soft and uneven. She stroked his fur, noticing how thin he was, how every rib seemed to protrude beneath his skin. Her heart ached, not just for him, but for herself. For the first time in years, she felt something other than emptiness, compassion, maybe, or the faint stirrings of love. Max didn't bark that night, nor did he whine. He simply stayed close, his body radiating a quiet gratitude that filled the room. Aisha cried then, tears she hadn't known were waiting slipping down her cheeks. She cried for her loneliness, for the years she'd spent numb, for the dog who had somehow found her in a park on a rainy day. And as her tears fell, Max lifted his head, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, no pity, just a deep, unwavering loyalty, as if he were saying, "I'm here now. You're not alone anymore." Over the next few weeks, Max became her shadow. He followed her everywhere, around the apartment, to the kitchen where she fumbled to make him food from scraps, to the living room where she'd sit with a book she could no longer focus on. His presence was a constant, a heartbeat in a house that had been silent for too long. Every evening, when Aisha returned from work, exhausted and defeated by another day of monotony, Max would be waiting by the door. His tail would wag furiously, his whole body shaking with joy, and he'd let out a soft, eager whimper that sounded like music to her ears. She began to talk to him, at first hesitantly, then with a flood of words she'd kept locked inside. "You know, Max," she'd say, her voice cracking, "I never thought I'd meet anyone. But now I can't imagine life without you." He'd tilt his head, his ears perking up, and she'd laugh, a sound she hadn't made in years. It was a fragile laugh, tinged with sadness, but it was real, and Max seemed to cherish it as much as she did. One night, as thunder rumbled outside and lightning illuminated the room, Aisha sat cross-legged on the floor, Max curled up beside her. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You saved me, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was drowning, and you pulled me out." Max's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a love so pure it took her breath away. It wasn't just gratitude or dependency, it was a bond, forged in the rain-soaked moment they'd met, that promised to grow deeper with every passing day. But beneath her newfound joy was a flicker of fear. She knew life was unpredictable, that nothing lasted forever. Yet, as Max nuzzled closer, his warmth seeping into her bones, Aisha pushed the fear aside. For now she had him, and he had her. In a world that had always felt cold and indifferent, Max was her light, her reason to keep going. And as she drifted to sleep that night, his head resting on her lap, she made a silent vow to love him with all she had, for as long as he would let her. The years that followed Aisha's chance encounter with Max were a tapestry of quiet joys and unspoken understandings. In the small cluttered apartment that had once felt like a prison, Max brought life, warmth, and a sense of purpose. He was more than a companion, he was her anchor, her reason to smile on days when the world seemed determined to break her. Every morning, his eager eyes and wagging tail greeted her like she was the most important person in the universe. Every night, he'd curl up beside her on the couch, his soft breathing a lullaby that chased away her fears. But beneath the surface of their idyllic routine, a strange tension began to grow. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Aisha noticed Max would sometimes freeze in the middle of the night, his ears pricked, staring at the door, as if he heard something she couldn't. At first she brushed it off, as the instincts of a stray who'd known hardship, but the frequency of these moments increased. His growls were low, almost inaudible, but they sent a shiver down her spine. "What is it, Max?" she'd whisper, her voice trembling, but he'd only look at her with those deep, knowing eyes, as if guarding a secret he couldn't share. One evening, as autumn painted the leaves outside in shades of gold and crimson, the tension reached a breaking point. Aisha had come home late from work, her mind clouded with stress from a demanding boss and endless deadlines. She unlocked the door, expecting Max's usual joyous welcome, but the apartment was eerily silent. No wagging tail, no soft whimpers. Her heart skipped a beat as she called out, "Max. Where are you?" The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under her feet. She dropped her bag, panic rising like bile in her throat. "Max," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. Then from the kitchen, she heard it, a low guttural growl, followed by a thud. Her blood ran cold as she grabbed a broomstick from the corner, her hands shaking. What if someone had broken in? What if Max was hurt, or worse? She crept toward the kitchen, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. The door was ajar, and a sliver of light spilled onto the floor. As she pushed it open, she saw him, Max, standing rigid, his hackles raised, staring at the back window. The glass was intact, but the curtains billowed slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. There was no one there, no sign of forced entry, yet Max's growl deepened, his body trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "Max, what's wrong?" Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to her, his eyes wild, and for the first time, she saw something in them that chilled her to the core, terror. Not the fear of a dog caught in a storm, but the fear of something he understood, and she didn't. He barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted toward the front door, scratching at it as if desperate to escape, or to protect her. Aisha's mind raced. Was someone watching them? Had Max sensed danger she couldn't see? She checked the locks, her fingers fumbling, and peered out the peephole, but the hallway was empty, the building silent. Yet the feeling lingered, a prickling at the back of her neck, a whisper of dread that refused to leave. That night, she barely slept. Max stayed by her side, his body pressed against hers, his eyes never closing. Every creak, every rustle outside made her jump, and she wondered if she was losing her mind, or if Max was trying to warn her of something unimaginable. The next day, Aisha called in sick to work, her nerves frayed. She watched Max closely, noticing how he'd pause at every corner, sniffing the air, his ears twitching at sounds she couldn't hear. She decided to take him for a walk, hoping fresh air might calm them both. But as they stepped outside, Max froze on the sidewalk, his growl returning, deeper and more menacing than before. Aisha followed his gaze to the alley across the street, a dark shadowed space where the street lights didn't reach. Her stomach churned. Was someone there, watching, waiting? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the alley, a metal trash can toppling over. Aisha screamed, clutching Max's leash, but he lunged forward, pulling her toward the sound. "No, Max, stop," she cried, but he was unstoppable, driven by an instinct she couldn't comprehend. They reached the alley, and there was nothing, no person, no animal, just scattered garbage and an eerie silence. Yet Max stood rigid, staring into the darkness, his growl fading into a whimper, as if whatever he'd sensed had slipped away. That night, as thunder rumbled and rain lashed against the windows, Aisha made a decision. She knelt beside Max, her hands cupping his face, and whispered, "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. I promise." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, an unspoken promise was forged, not just of love, but of protection, of a bond that transcended fear. But as she held him close, a single question haunted her. What was out there, and why did Max, her loyal guardian, seem so terrified? The suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the nights grew darker, and the shadows deeper. Aisha didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, a mystery that would test their bond and lead to a moment that would change everything. For now, she clung to Max, her heart racing, her mind racing faster, wondering if the love they shared would be enough to survive the unknown. The months after that eerie night in the alley stretched into years, but the memory of Max's frantic growls and Aisha's pounding heart never faded. Their lives settled back into a rhythm of quiet companionship, but a new undercurrent of unease lingered. Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting though no more strange incidents occurred. Max, too, seemed to carry a weight, his once playful demeanor tempered by a vigilance that never fully dissipated. Yet through it all their bond only deepened, a lifeline in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. But time, relentless and unforgiving, began to cast its shadow over their quiet haven. Max was no longer the sprightly dog who had bounded into Aisha's life on that rainy afternoon. His muzzle grayed, his steps slowed, and his once shiny coat grew dull and thin. Aisha noticed the changes with a sinking heart, each wrinkle in his face, each labored breath, a stab of pain she tried to ignore. She told herself he was fine, that he'd always be there, that their love could defy the cruel march of time, but deep down, she knew better. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside their window, Aisha woke to find Max struggling to stand. His legs trembled, and a soft whimper escaped his lips as he looked at her, his eyes clouded with a mixture of confusion and pain. Aisha's chest tightened, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "Oh Max," she whispered, rushing to his side, her hands trembling as she helped him up. He leaned against her, his body warm but frail, and she felt the fragility of his once strong frame. From that day, Aisha's world began to shrink. Work, friends, even the mysterious shadows that had once haunted her faded into the background. All that mattered was Max. She took him to the vet, who confirmed what she already feared. Max was old, his joints aching, his heart weakening. "Make him comfortable," the vet advised gently, his words a dagger to her soul. Aisha nodded, tears blurring her vision, but inside, she screamed. How could she make him comfortable, when every day without his full strength felt like a betrayal of their bond? She spoiled him relentlessly, new beds, special treats, extra walks in the park, even though he could only shuffle a few steps before needing to rest. She talked to him constantly, her voice a mix of love and desperation. "You're my everything, Max," she'd say, stroking his graying head as he lay by her feet. "I can't lose you, I won't." He'd look up at her, his eyes still holding that same unwavering love, but now there was a sadness in them, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. Nights became the hardest. Aisha would lie awake, listening to Max's shallow breathing, each rasp a reminder of how time was slipping away. She'd reach out, her fingers brushing his fur, and he'd stir, pressing closer as if to reassure her. But the reassurance was fleeting, replaced by a gnawing fear that grew with each passing day. What would she do when he was gone? How could she face a world without his steady presence, his silent strength? One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Aisha sat on the balcony with Max nestled in her lap. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and impending winter. She watched as he closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with effort, and a sob escaped her. "You can't leave me, Max," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Who will love me like you do? Who will know me like you do?" Max opened his eyes, and for a moment, Aisha saw a flicker of the dog he'd once been, the fearless guardian, who had pulled her from loneliness, the loyal friend who had faced the shadows with her. He lifted his head slightly, his nose brushing her hand, and she felt a tear slide down her cheek. It was as if he was trying to tell her something, to ease her pain, but the words were trapped behind his tired eyes. The suspense of those days was not the sharp, thrilling kind from the alley incident, but a slow, aching dread that coiled tighter with each sunrise. Aisha began to notice other signs: Max's refusal to eat some days, the way he'd sometimes stare at the door, not with fear this time, but with a wistful longing, as if he could see something she couldn't. Was he waiting for something? Was he preparing to leave her? One night, as thunder rumbled in the distance and rain tapped against the windows, Aisha held Max close, her arms wrapped around his frail body. "I love you, Max," she murmured, her voice thick with tears. "I love you more than anything." He whimpered softly, his tail giving a weak wag, and she clung to that small gesture like a lifeline. But even as she held him, she knew the shadow of time was closing in, a specter she couldn't fight, no matter how fiercely she loved him. The bond they shared, once a beacon of light, now felt like a fragile thread, stretched taut by the weight of impending loss. Aisha's heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and grief, gratitude for the years they'd had, grief for the years they wouldn't. She wondered if Max felt it too, if he knew how much she needed him, how much she feared the day he'd be gone. As the rain fell harder, Aisha made a silent vow: she would cherish every moment left, no matter how painful. She would hold him, feed him, love him until his last, and when the time came, she would let him go, even if it broke her. But for now, she held him tighter, her tears mixing with his fur, praying that somehow, some way, love could defy the shadow of time. The days after that stormy night on the balcony blurred into a haze of dread and desperate hope for Aisha. Max's condition worsened with each passing hour, his frail body a shadow of the vibrant companion he had once been. His breathing grew shallower, his eyes dimmer, and the once familiar wag of his tail became a rare, fleeting gesture that broke Aisha's heart anew each time. She moved through her apartment like a ghost, her every action driven by a single overwhelming fear: the moment she would have to say goodbye. She tried everything to hold on to him: special diets, medications, endless vet visits, but the vet's words echoed in her mind like a cruel prophecy. "It's time to let him go, Aisha. He's in pain." Those words were a knife, twisting deeper with each repetition. How could she let him go? How could she release the one being who had filled her empty life with love, who had stood by her through loneliness, fear, and mystery? Max was more than a dog, he was her soulmate, her protector, her reason to keep breathing. One gray morning, as winter's chill seeped through the cracks of their apartment, Aisha knew the end was near. Max lay on his favorite blanket, his body so still that for a moment she panicked, thinking he was already gone. But then his chest rose faintly, a shallow, labored breath, and she sank to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Max, please," she whispered, her voice raw with anguish. "Don't leave me, I need you." He opened his eyes, those same deep brown eyes that had first captured her heart under the park bench years ago. They were clouded now, but still held that unmistakable love, a love so pure it made her chest ache. He tried to lift his head, but it fell back, too heavy, too weak. Instead he stretched out a paw, trembling, and placed it on her hand. It was the gentlest touch, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, a final act of reassurance, a silent promise that he would always be with her, even when he couldn't stay. Aisha called the vet, her voice breaking as she explained the situation. The vet arrived within the hour, his face somber, his eyes kind but firm. "It's the kindest thing you can do for him now," he said softly, and Aisha nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. She held Max in her arms as the vet prepared the injection, her tears soaking his fur, her sobs muffled against his neck. "You were my everything, Max," she cried. "How am I supposed to live without you?" Max looked at her, and in that moment time seemed to slow. There was no fear in his gaze, no pain, just love, infinite and unwavering, as if he were telling her it was okay, that he was ready, that he trusted her to let him go. His tail gave one last feeble wag, a gesture so small yet so profound that it shattered what was left of Aisha's heart. It was as if he was saying, "I love you too, I'll always love you." The vet administered the injection, and Aisha held her breath, her arms tightening around Max as if she could anchor him to this world. His body relaxed, the tension of pain and age melting away, and for a brief second, she thought she saw a spark of his old self, a flicker of the dog who had run through parks, barked at shadows and filled her life with joy. Then his chest stilled, and the silence that followed was deafening. Ayesha screamed, a raw guttural sound that tore from her throat and echoed through the empty apartment. She clutched Max's lifeless body, rocking back and forth, her tears falling like rain. "No, no, no," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a whisper. "You can't be gone, you can't leave me alone." But he was gone, his warmth fading, his presence reduced to a stillness that crushed her soul. The vet left quietly, giving her space, but Ayesha barely noticed. She sat there for hours, holding Max, her mind a whirlwind of grief and memories. She remembered the first time she saw him, shivering under that bench, the way his eyes had locked onto hers with a desperate hope. She remembered his protective growls in the alley, his silent companionship on lonely nights, his unwavering love through every storm. And now, he was gone, and the world felt emptier than it ever had before. The apartment, once filled with the sound of his paws and his soft whimpers, was now a tomb of silence. Ayesha looked around, seeing his toys scattered on the floor, his collar hanging by the door, his bed still warm from his body. Each object was a knife, cutting deeper into her already bleeding heart. She wondered how she would ever move on, how she could face a future without his steady gaze, his quiet strength, his silent love. But even in her despair, a small part of her clung to the memory of that final wag, that last touch of his paw. It was a goodbye, yes, but also a promise that their love wasn't truly over, that it transcended this moment, this loss. She kissed his forehead, her lips lingering on his cold fur, and whispered, "I'll never forget you, Max, never." As night fell, Ayesha laid Max on his blanket one last time, covering him with the quilt they'd shared so many nights. She sat beside him, staring into the darkness, her heart a shattered thing. The suspense of those final days, the dread of his decline, the fear of his departure, had culminated in this unbearable reality. He was gone, but his love lingered, a ghost in the shadows, a whisper in the silence. And as she wept, Ayesha vowed to carry that love with her, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how long the silence lasted. The days after Max's silent goodbye were a blur of pain and emptiness for Ayesha. The apartment, once filled with the soft patter of his paws and the warmth of his presence, now felt like a hollow shell, echoing with the ghost of his absence. She moved through her life mechanically, her heart a heavy stone in her chest, each breath a reminder of the love she had lost. Work became a distant obligation, friends' condolences a distant hum. Nothing could fill the void Max had left behind. She buried him in the small backyard of her apartment building, under the same tree where they'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset. She placed his favorite toy, a tattered tennis ball, and his collar beside him, along with a bouquet of wild flowers, their fragile beauty, a stark contrast to the permanence of his departure. Every morning, she visited his grave, sitting cross-legged in the grass, her tears watering the earth as she whispered, "I miss you so much, Max. How am I supposed to go on without you?" The nights were the worst. The silence was oppressive, broken only by her own sobs or the occasional creak of the floorboards. She couldn't bear to look at his bed, his toys, or the spot on the couch where he'd always lain. Each object was a dagger, a reminder of the joy he'd brought, and the pain of his absence. She wondered if she'd ever feel whole again, if the world would ever stop feeling so cold and empty. Weeks turned into months, and Ayesha began to withdraw, her grief a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. She stopped answering calls, stopped going out, stopped living. But one night, as winter gave way to the tentative warmth of spring, something shifted. She dreamt of Max. In the dream, he was young again, his fur glossy, his eyes bright with that familiar love. He ran through a field of golden grass, his tail wagging furiously, and when he turned to look at her, he barked, a joyful clear sound that made her heart leap. "Come on, Ayesha," his bark seemed to say, and she followed, her feet light, her spirit lifted. The field stretched endlessly, bathed in warm sunlight, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of peace. Max stopped, turned, and pressed his nose against her hand, just as he had that first rainy day. Then, as suddenly as the dream began, it ended, and Ayesha woke with a start, her cheeks wet with tears, but this time, they were tears of something other than despair. On her pillow lay a single white feather, soft and pristine, as if dropped from the sky. Ayesha stared at it, her heart racing. She didn't know where it had come from. There were no birds in her apartment, no open windows, but she felt a strange certainty that it was a sign. "Max," she whispered, clutching the feather to her chest. Was it possible he was still with her, watching over her, loving her from beyond? From that night, Ayesha began to heal, though the pain never fully left. She started small, visiting Max's grave with fresh flowers, talking to him as if he could hear, feeling his presence in the rustle of leaves or the warmth of a sudden breeze. She kept the feather on her nightstand, a talisman of hope, a reminder that their bond wasn't truly broken. Slowly, she re-entered the world, her steps hesitant but steady, carrying Max's love like a shield against the loneliness. One afternoon, as she walked through the park where she'd first found him, she noticed a stray dog huddled under the same bench. It was smaller than Max, its fur a different shade, but its eyes held that same desperate hope. Ayesha froze, her breath catching. For a moment she saw Max in those eyes, the same loyalty, the same unspoken promise. She knelt, her hand trembling as she reached out, and the dog sniffed her fingers, then pressed close, its tail wagging weakly. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You're not him, but maybe you need me as much as I needed him." She took the dog home, naming her Luna, and though the pain of losing Max remained, Luna brought a new kind of light, a chance to love again, to honor Max's memory by opening her heart once more. As summer bloomed, Ayesha felt Max's presence more strongly than ever. She dreamt of him often now, always in that golden field, always with that same joyful bark. Each dream left her with a sense of peace, a certainty that he was okay, that he was waiting for her, that their love had transcended time and death. She began to write about him, pouring her grief and love onto paper, creating a tribute to the dog who had saved her life in more ways than she could count. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, the colors Max had loved to chase, Ayesha sat on her balcony with Luna by her side. She looked at the sky, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in months, and whispered, "Thank you, Max, for everything." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard a soft bark, faint but clear, carried on the wind. The suspense of those dark months, the fear of losing herself to grief, the uncertainty of moving forward, had given way to a quiet hope. Ayesha knew she would never stop missing Max, never stop loving him, but she also knew his love would guide her, a silent guardian in the shadows. Their bond, forged in rain, and strengthened through fear and joy, was eternal, a love beyond time, a silent goodbye that promised reunion in another life. As she watched the stars emerge, Luna nuzzled closer, and Ayesha smiled through her tears. She was still broken, still healing, but she was no longer alone. And somewhere she believed, Max was running free, his tail wagging, his eyes bright with the love that would never fade.